Hey there, I'm Ryan and welcome to today's acrylic landscape lesson. All of the tools and materials will be listed in the video description. And if you'd like help with the drawing process, I will have the traceable up over on Patreon. If you're interested, check it out. But with that, let's jump in and have some fun. Also, if you've ever wanted to work with exactly what I am, you can now actually purchase my personalized brush set in the video description. So you'll never have to question if your brush is the right size or the right stiffness. You'll be working with exactly what I am. We're going to begin here today with a 1-inch flat-headed brush, and we'll proceed to dip the bottom third of it into a little bit of water, then proceed to wipe off the excess. This will just help us keep our paint wet for a longer period of time. And with that, we will grab an abundance of our titanium white, move that down here on our palette. We'll grab the smallest hint of an ultramarine blue. We don't want too much, but we do want to create a contrast between the orange and the sky. Then we'll also grab a hint of Mars black, and we'll work these into a bit of a cooler gray. From there, once we have it well mixed, we're going to look for the openings. There aren't too many, but you do want to do slightly more than you think you'll need, simply because it'll give you more option when you're painting in the foliage. Because realistically, you can cover all of it up if you want to, but it's difficult to go back in and add more of it. We're also making it quite thick in application. And I'm going over my drawing. Not too worried about it. We can always go back and redraw it. Again, the traceable will be in the video description up over on Patreon. There we go. Now I am going to do a second layer because we just want thick pigment. However, I'm actually going to use this as an opportunity to brighten it slightly. Maybe interject a little bit more blue. You don't have to. We are working on a fall piece, and having a nice gray cloudy sky can actually be really nice. However, we do have this option, and I think I just want mine to be a little bit brighter. We're still keeping it gray, we're still interjecting the blue, but you can see that you have quite a bit of option. And typically, with acrylics, because they are innately so thin, a couple of layers really will make it look a lot better, even if you go with the exact same color and hue. You do have this opportunity to play with it should you want to. Also, you can see that there's a little bit of texture because I'm using an abundance of paint. It's quite thick. It's not really an issue, especially with acrylics, because as they dry, they typically shrink to about a third of what they're normally like when you apply them. So achieving texture is actually quite difficult. It's doable, but you don't have to worry about it too much. Now, for the next step, we need all of that to be fully dry. We need a clean brush and water because we don't want our blue mixing with yellow and rendering a green. That said, here we have a cadmium red, cadmium yellow, and a burnt sienna. We're going to start our new mixture with cadmium red, about an equal amount, if not slightly more, of our cadmium yellow. Then we're going to need to desaturate it and brighten it a little bit. So we'll add about a third of that in titanium white, and the more we mix, the more I realize I would like a little bit more yellow in here. Then we're just going to make it slightly more earthy, and that's what the burnt sienna is for. It in itself has a bit of an orange hue to it, but it will relax the pigment. And that right there is a great initial backing color. Now, I'm going to take this brush, put it down, switch to the filbert, which I'm going to make sure it's nice and damp. We'll grab this, and we're just going to paint in the background around our trees. We'll be layering a lot of
pigment on top of it. But we're using this brush, so around the edges where the leaves touch the sky, we can do this rotated tap and get a really nice look of foliage, or at least the implication of it. When we go back in later and we add volume and texture and all of that, it'll look a lot better, but right now we are just getting that nice base in. I'll get you a little bit closer. Also, I apologize if my speech is a little harder to listen to than it normally is. I just got Invisalign in, and I'm not used to talking yet. I did all this reading initially about how I probably have a bad lisp for the first couple of weeks. Well, I adapted, and I can definitely hear it. I don't think it's as bad as it could have been, but it's not amazing. And I really wanted to still make videos, do these fall paintings, but again, I do apologize if it's just a little off from what it's normally like. Something else I'm noticing I'm doing is I'm kind of dodging certain words, and because of that, sometimes they're just holes in sentences. Which sounds ridiculous, but it's something I'm trying to be cognizant of and be better with. But here, as you can see, back to painting, lots of rotating of the brush along those edges, not so much in the larger areas. And again, we're leaving more sky than we need to, because we'll go back in and fill that out to a greater degree with the different brush once we really know exactly what we're doing, what we want to do. I'm also using a good amount of pigment. It's never thin, and that is very intentional. Because we want to do multiple layers, but it's a lot easier to do multiple layers when your initial layers are thick. There we go. And now, as we step back, we can see that we just have a little bit more to fill in. Again, lots of tapping, and you'll see that we do get faster at it as we go. We're starting with such a bright pigment because this is essentially the backing of the leaves that are farthest away from us are the ones that will receive the most light. And as we progressively add more orange and different oranges, we'll make it darker, have higher contrast. But again, that is where we build our depth and texture. Now what we're going to do is start randomly filling in some of the negative space, and we're going to do so with a fan brush. However, I'm going to make my fan brush quite damp, and that's going to condense the bristles so that I don't end up creating as many markings. And with that, here you can see it after a little bit of water. Now, instead of making 50 little applications, we'll probably make 5 or 6, and then I'll go and I'll grab some of that pigment, and I will rotate my brush around the edges to create some of those leaves that kind of break away from the larger clusters. We'll also use this brush when it's not wet later on to create some real texture. Very versatile brush it is, from the new brush set, which you can get in the video description. But as you can see, very quickly we can incorporate some extra foliage. And this is why we weren't doing too much initially with the filbert. We knew we were going to go back in. And you can see some areas are still very open and some become this pattern instead. By pressing slightly harder with your brush, you'll get a larger marking. Some areas you'll want that, some areas you'll want it to be a bit smaller. There we go. But I'm also rotating the brush in the air, not once the brush has touched canvas. Now, we're going to take our flat-headed brush. We're going to make our orange a bit more earthy. So work in some burnt sienna. I'm going to grab a little bit more red. We're going to start moving the orange into a bit of a red. Just like that. And we'll also grab the smallest hint of Mars Black. And I do mean the smallest hint because it's a very strong pigment, of which we do not need a grand amount of. So, that brush goes back down. We pick up the damp fan brush. And then we go towards the center of the larger clusters. And we start building out additional leaves. And this is going to be the beginning of some contrast, a little bit of texture. I'm avoiding the edges for the most part because light is working its way around those edges. But we will have the occasional overlap, and this will find its way over there just because there will be smaller, more condensed spaces, which will still need that darker implication. You can see I'm really working through a lot of paint here. We have a good amount of surface area to cover. And I'm still trying to be very loose with my application. Something I'm doing that I probably shouldn't is I'm holding the brush like this, or if you hold it farther back, you'll relinquish control to a point, and you won't subconsciously continuously do the same thing to the same degree. It's still inevitable to a point, but it can be avoided. Again, we're avoiding the edges for the most part. There we go. Now we need to let this dry before we do the next layer. But in the meantime, we should clean our brushes a little bit just so the paint doesn't dry on them. And then we'll continue building this out. Okay, so now we're heading back to our mix, and yet again, much like last time, we are going for a darker mix than what we currently have. I'm going to leave a little bit of the previous one right here on the side, that way I can just use it as an example of where we were. That way I know that I'm moving in the right direction, but I'm not doing so in too dramatic of a way. So here, it's a very dark, which I like, but we don't want these jumps to be too grand. So we will interject a little bit of that titanium white back into the mixture. Get the majority of the pigment off this brush. and switch back over to the fan. Now, yet again, we want to incorporate the majority of these markings into the middle sections with the occasional stray. This time, I am holding my brush a bit farther back, as I suggested in the last clip. And we can start building it out to be a bit thicker, so it isn't all texture. You can see right here it's a bit more blocky. I'll do that to a point through here as well, just because I don't want it to be over textured, too visually stimulating. We need a balance. There we go. This also isn't the final layer for what we're doing, so we do want to essentially leave room to continue to darken. And I'm going to do a lot more of it towards the edges, because the larger opening is really in the middle. And that means the edges are going to really collect the most shadows. Lots of space over here. You can really see the contrast of the two. Starting this painting with a lot of tapping and really just sinking into it through repetition, which I personally find very cathartic. Now, we do need a lot more foliage. However, I want to layer it on top of our trees, so we need to paint those first. Now, I cleaned my brush, and we have a new color here on our palette, that being a phthalo green. And we're going to use this as a little bit of variance in our colors. We'll grab some Mars Black. We'll make it a bit more earthy with our burnt sienna, so it's still somewhat cohesive. And then we'll grab a little bit of titanium white. We'll get this nice mossy green for our trees. And then, using that 1 inch flat, I'm just going to start dropping in the first layer. And it's worth noting, our painting is going to look very odd, a little messy for the next 20 or so minutes, and that's okay. It's part of the process. It's how we get to a great painting. Just have faith in yourself. And you can also note that you have seen the thumbnail. You know what the painting turns into, so you know that we do get out of the awkward phase which we are currently entering into. That said, I'm working around some of my foliage. You can see that I'll skip a little area and then I'll do a tap here, a tap there. That way it looks like we're already weaving in and out. There we go. Have a much larger opening through here. Following the reference photo to a good degree, but not fully. And then I'll make a couple of smaller ones. It's worth noting that the less pressure you apply with your brush, the smaller your markings can be. And what we're painting right now isn't going to be the final version of these trees either. We're going to build them up through at least 2 more layers. We're just getting started and implementing those bases. This larger flat-headed brush is great because we're able to move a lot of paint fairly quickly, and we're able to do so with very sharp edging. I think I want another larger tree right here. Don't be afraid to take artistic liberties. Make it your own when you feel inspired. Need an abundance of additional paint now. Might even make it slightly darker as we move towards the trees on the edges. There we go. And one more big one towards the right hand side. But this one actually goes all the way down here. Not going to worry about that right now. Just going to fill in the base for the top. I'm not going to bother with the bottom just because we'll be painting over it to a great degree when we incorporate the ground. And it will get extremely messy quickly. So right now, instead, I'll just focus on creating additional little trees, ones that overlap each other to a degree. They don't all have to be straight. They don't all have to go towards the bottom. They can just kind of poke out randomly. That said, they will present themselves more towards the bottom than anywhere else. Typically, we'll see them where there is the light, because that is where the opening in the foliage is. And if you make an area on top much larger, we go back down to make the bottom area larger as well. Just so that it makes sense. And now we can even do little branches, different directions. Just slowly building it up, right? Still admittedly looking fairly awkward, but that's okay. That's how it's meant to be. We can also switch to a different brush, but because this one is damp, those bristles are condensed, and I'm able to render these very sharp looking markings, which are great for what we're doing right now. Remember that we're going to be adding foliage over a lot of it, so we will be losing a lot of these branches, which is why I'm okay with painting such an abundance of them. go. Now that everything has had a chance to dry, I am quickly just going to go in and do a secondary layer on a lot of the background trees here, specifically the larger ones. The smaller ones can be a bit more semi-transparent because we essentially want that light to look like it's wrapping around to a point. And here I'm actually just trying to make the trees a little bit brighter, that way we can make a darker texture on them. There we go, that's perfect. So we're just making sure it's nice and thick, looks professional. The phthalo green is a bit of a thin pigment. So we do need those layers. Okay, now that the base of our trees is fully dry to the touch, we're going to render a much darker variant of what we've been working with. So starting with the Mars Black, just a little bit of our Phthalo Green, smallest hint of Titanium White, and we can avoid the Burnt Sienna for this mix, but we'll put our brush down. We'll go back and we'll grab our fan brush, but as you can see, our fan brush is dry now, so the bristles aren't condensed. So that means we'll be able to make significantly more markings. We'll grab this very dark mixture, and I'll just start tapping in all of this texture into the trees. I'm going to do so for the most part using these vertical taps. However, there's a slight lean to my brush back and forth just to create variance. And this is essentially for all of the little divots in the tree bark. All of the areas that can't receive light. We are going to go in and add highlights, moss, all of that. But we do want that initial texture. And this is really such an easy and effective way of doing so. Additionally, texturally, it's very cohesive with everything we've previously done in the actual leaves, so it fits well within the setting. There we go. Don't need too much of it, but we do want to define this texture. This tree is quite large, so rather than just doing the horizontal markings, I'm adding a bit more of a sway into my tap. And again, we'll finish the rest of the tree a little bit later. But yet again, we'll let this dry, and then we can go back in with some additional detail. So now that that darker texture is dry, we're going to head back to the 1 inch, and we're going to render the brightest green that we have yet. So we'll start with equal mixture of our green and our titanium white. Then we'll grab about half of that in our burnt sienna to make it a bit more earthy, just like so. And maybe just a little bit more titanium white, desaturate it, brighten it, hint of Mars Black, desaturate it, darken it, and I think that's a great pigment right now. So we'll switch over to our liner brush, first time using it in this one. Great for real detail work, great for intentional detail work. We also have things like the fan brush, which is great for detail work, but it's not all intentional marking. A lot of it is so randomized, right? Where this will give us the opportunity to be very intentional. So I'm going to start by applying this predominantly towards the right-hand side of this tree, because the light's coming in and it will brighten that area. And I can already tell that I want it to be brighter. So we'll put that down, grab more titanium white, work that into the mixture. We need to brighten it because while what we had on the palette may have been bright enough, it wasn't that color on the painting. And that's important to know, to remember, because we're not just getting the color that we have on our palette, we're getting a mixture of that and whatever color is underneath. And in this case, it's very dark. So it makes that color that we had on the palette darker. I'm looking for all of the openings. So wherever there's a light, very specifically, I'm adding a lot of pigment there. And then I'm making it a bit more sparse as we get into these darker areas. We can do this on the other side as well. There we go. Not the easiest thing to see, but does make a difference. Here I'm adding it on the left-hand side because we have a lot of openings, a lot of light in that area. And then we have openings over here on the right-hand side, so I'll apply it there. So we're kind of jumping back and forth between sides of the trees. The majority of the light is coming this way, so we'll add it to the right-hand side of this tree to begin. And then through tapped drags, we'll just build up a bit of highlight. If you can get some tooth of the canvas in there, it actually looks like nice texture on the wood. Remember, we'll be covering quite a bit of this with additional foliage. So if there are areas you don't love, that's okay. But do try to be precise with your applications, meaningful, intentional, because we have a real opportunity here to build some good depth. You can also apply it to some of the distant backing branches. And now, while we were painting it predominantly on the right-hand side of these, we're predominantly painting it on the left-hand side of the trees on the right-hand side of the canvas, just because of where the light is for the most part. And when we do this, we need to make sure we are very close. When I say very close, I mean on the edge, because you don't want the edge to be darker and then it to get brighter. You want that edge to be the brightest point. That's something I see a lot when I review work. And it's a very easy fix that'll make your painting look a whole lot better. Again, as the paint starts to run out, I move in towards the center of the tree with a bit of a loose stroke, leaving lots of openings. Like that. We also, of course, need to handle the big one right over here. I'm going to start with the edge. And then we'll start working our way in, creating raised areas of bark for moss to latch onto, grow up. But I don't want to do too much towards the left, so we start on that side that's going to receive the light, and then we let it dissipate as we move back this way. Now we'll get even closer and render an even brighter mixture than what we're currently working with. Still want a little bit of burnt sienna in there, a little bit of Mars black, but we're mixing on top of or beside our previous mix so we can see that it is in fact getting brighter. I don't want it to be too saturated, so that's why we do need the Mars black and a little bit of the burnt sienna. But as you can see, we can still get something that's quite dramatically different from what we were previously working with. There we go, perfect. From there, put that brush down, pick up the liner, and apply this solely, initially, to the areas in which light is really coming through. Just like that. And then as it starts to dissipate, I'll incorporate a little bit into the trees that are farther back. Again, it is imperative that we get the true edges. Especially with this pigment. Also, a lot of the markings that I've been making are elongated. They can also be a series of taps like this to really show some texture. Can be quite a nice look. But we do want to save that predominantly for the larger trees, or at least the ones that are closer to us and therefore look larger because of perspective, like this one. See that? Once all of that is fully dry, we are going to go to our clean flathead brush. It is imperative that we clean our water, our brushes, everything, because we're going back to yellow. But once all of that's done, we are going to grab some of our yellow, mix that on top of our previously assigned darkest foliage color. We'll grab about half of that in our cadmium red, grab an equal amount of burnt sienna to the initial yellow that we were using. Now we can interject some Mars black. We had to add a lot of red and the burnt sienna before we added the Mars black because the Mars black and the yellow would render a green, which is nice, but not what we need right now. So we'll just mix this up into a darker, more brown variant of an orange. Just like that. Get the majority of pigment off the brush, and then switch over to the fan brush. Now if you want really small markings, we can make sure that it isn't damp, or again we can dampen it to condense those bristles. And then we can grab our pigment and get back to layering this. However, now we're layering it also on top of our trees to a point, which is really nice. We can build additional depth that way. Remember, because it's a darker pigment, we want it predominantly in the centers of our clusters. We also want more of it down towards the bottom area because we'll just naturally have less light there, as there will be more foliage to render shadows on it. There we go. Starting to look okay. A lot of work to be done yet, but we're getting there. That said, let's get you a little bit closer. Okay, so we'll jump back into it. Again, I want my edges to be quite a bit darker, so I'll apply extra foliage in this value around there, creating a slight vignette effect. And as we talk about in most lessons, we do like to incorporate a little bit of a vignette often, because it will draw the viewer's eye towards the center of the piece, as the eye innately goes to the brightest point of any piece. It goes for photography, film, and painting. A lot to work in around here. We're being somewhat selective in regards to which trees we overlap with this, what areas of them. Because we don't want to overlap all of the trees, but we also want to overlap enough that it looks natural, right? You can tell that I really want to fill out this area a bit more. I think I want a more dense center. Have this kind of connect out to a greater degree. We can create openings again if we accidentally overdo it. And we can't forget about these bottom areas. Now, one more time, we are going to darken this pigment, desaturate it a little bit, get that titanium white in there, but also making sure that we have the darkest mixture that we've rendered thus far. Just like so, nice and earthy. Make our brush nice and damp. From there, we can apply this type of mixture one more time. Then we're actually going to build up some highlight again. So we're just going back and forth. But these markings can be a little bit larger because they're closer to us. So you can press harder with your brush to render something a bit more stark. Predominantly doing it towards the edges, as you can see. And we can further define some of these a little bit later with the liner brush or the filbert. However, for now I think it actually looks quite nice. We're definitely getting there. Now we're going to get quite a bit closer, grab our cadmium yellow, a little bit of our red, a little bit of our burnt sienna, quite a bit of our titanium white. We want a brighter yellowish orange. We want it to be nice and thick, and the titanium white will really help us with that. And then we're going to switch to our liner brush and very intentionally rework in highlight predominantly in the center area. Now we don't want it to have a lot of water because we can't thin it much. So our marks are essentially going to be as large as the tip of the brush. We're essentially looking at where the light is and then working it back in. And this is where we reestablish a lot of our actual oranges. We can have little areas that poke out, get extra light like this, as we slowly work our way down towards it. I'll go over some areas a couple of times and really build up that highlight. We'll leave little openings to show that these clusters are three-dimensional. There we go. We're not doing it just there though. We do need this in other portions where light is coming through, and I am going to want to continue building it out to a point. Don't want too much around the edges, just because that is where the darker portions are and should continue to be. Going over this a couple of times, building it up. Now, apparently, my memory card decided to fill up, so we lost about 5 minutes of footage. But essentially, I've just remixed the darker pigment, and now I'm reworking that back on in a lot of these bottom areas and blending it up into the pigment we were just applying. I also want more of this towards the bottom, just because again the light won't really get here and illuminate this area in the same way. And the more layers we add, truly the better it's looking. We can go over some of our branches. There we go. Now, while we could and will go back to portions of the top here, we're going to take a break from that and start working on the bottom. That way we can balance it appropriately and not overdo the top, forcing us to overdo the bottom. So I'm going to switch back to the larger flat-headed brush. We'll grab an abundance of titanium white, and by titanium white I mean the opposite, in Mars black. We're going to put it right between our greens and our oranges, because I do want a mix of the two, but I do want slightly more of our green than our burnt sienna. And then we're going to grab a little bit of titanium white, not too much. And we're going to make a fairly dark base layer to work on top of, but it definitely has room to get darker. And as I apply it, I can tell that I already want it to be a bit brighter, because we want those shadows and those darker details that we can layer in after. Now, this will be the start of our ground, which will be covered in leaves and moss and rocks and all of those different things. So I'm just doing little taps with the corner of the brush to work its way up to create little mounds. We'll work it around these smaller trees, but in addition to that, we're going to leave open a couple of areas as some of these trees are closer to us and they extend downwards. And I just don't want to lose where they are. So we'll go down to their natural end. This will blend a little bit with this larger tree that we have, at least for now. And that will change once we have foliage and everything on this. Now we'll start working it down. I will cover this tree, we can just redraw that. And you can see that there are a lot of steps here. We can work this in between a lot of them and just kind of have these little visual reminders that they're there and they're the size that they are. I'm not too concerned about brush strokes, and in fact I'm being quite loose, and very intentionally so. Because we do want a lot of texture in this area. And just having those brush strokes is a great way to start that. That said, we're going to continue working our way down around the stairs. This flathead brush is great for it. You can see that we're covering a lot of space while easily defining that which we need to. However, so we get to about this half point, we're going to change our color a little bit to a bit more of a burnt sienna. I just want it to be a bit warmer in the foreground. You can see how it's a bit more thin, but that's okay. I'm just using an X-shaped pattern to bring the warmer pigment up and the cooler, more green pigment down. We will need to do a second layer there, but I'm going to let it dry. And I'll move the camera down a little bit so you can see a little bit better. So here we are, a little bit farther down, going in with a second layer. And already you can see just how much of a dramatic difference that extra bit of paint can make. We no longer see the canvas showing through. We'll apply this to the other side. Overlapping the green. And moving up in an X-shaped pattern. Now this side does look a little bit thin, but we can always go back to it. And it isn't a dramatic difference between the two, which is nice. That said, I do want to take some of this and work it right in between a lot of our steps here. Doesn't have to be too tidy. I just want to show that there's essentially this ground in between all of the boards that are holding it up and creating these very natural steps. Because these steps are essentially just going to be individual boards that are propped up by other little pieces of wood in front of them. It isn't a fully constructed stair. I want something a bit more natural for this, aesthetically. So now I'm just going over, doing that second layer. And we'll do a bit more of a green mix, yet again, towards the top, just because we do want that second, third application, make it nice and thick. Blend it down into the warmer bottom, work it into the separating steps, making it even a little bit patchy intentionally. There we go. Really like that. That said, we do need to let all of this dry. So that is our next step. After ensuring that we have good thick layers. Now we're going to take the larger flat-headed brush and make our current mixture quite a bit darker. So we're just interjecting Mars Black into it. We're not adding any titanium white. We're not adding any additional hue. We're just looking for a much darker variant of that which we are already using. And you can see that I'm keeping the smallest amount of green and the smallest amount of our burnt sienna mix on here, just in case I need them as a reference later. But I'm going to try to thin out a lot of this pigment on the palette so that I can pick it up with our fan brush. Now, it isn't damp right now, so we're going to get all of these little markings rather than 5 or 6 like we were with the foliage at the top. So we'll just grab a little bit of paint. We don't want too much. And then we're going to tap on this darker, smaller texture into the foreground. A lot of it is done through horizontal taps. However, it's not strictly horizontal. A lot of it has a little bit of an arc to it. And I'm essentially trying to create somewhat of a randomized tap, but also I want it to build up like this as a whole. So here's an example of it, very intentional. But then I want to distract from how intentional it is by adding in some additional randomized taps. We don't really want a series of lines, and we can avoid that by just being more mindful of how we're rotating our brush. This is definitely a step that can just be very cathartic, very enjoyable. So we kind of turn our brain off and have fun with it. But by being intentional with your mark making here, you can get a much better looking piece. I'm letting it dissipate as you move up towards the top, so I don't have a lot of pigment on my brush right now, and that is intentionally so. I don't want the top area to be too stark. And then you can take down a little bit of that texture into the bottom portion. That said, we've completed one side, and we have two. So we'll start working over here. There's a very large, darker mound, which I'll create right there. We can overlap the steps, that's no issue. Again, for greater randomization, hold your brush farther back. We also want to work this in between the steps. Once you start to get into a flow of it, really is a lot of fun. Trying to get a lot of my paint off right here because I don't want to bring a grand amount of it up into the top. I just want a little bit of that subtle texture. Just like that. That's perfect, actually. Love that. And I'll just be a little playful. Now, once all of that is fully dry to the touch, we are going to go back to clean water with a clean flat-headed brush because we're moving away from the darker pigments, and we're going to create a mid-value that's essentially an earthy hue, reminiscent of an orange, but we're not going to use a lot of our cadmium red or cadmium yellow. We'll use a little bit of it, but I do want this to be quite a bit more subtle than what we used for the top area, because all of these leaves have fallen. They don't have the color that they once did, and that's good because it'll keep the painting more balanced. If anything, I think I want this to be just a bit more red. And we'll do a couple of layers, so the color will change over time, but I like that a lot as our initial color. Switching back to the fan brush, it is fully dry, so yet again I'll be rendering a lot of markings rather than 5 or 6. And I'm going to apply this similarly to how we did our last layer, in that it's a grand series of taps. They'll dissipate as we move up towards the top. So as I run out of paint, I move upwards. You can see just how subtle that is in relation to what we have at the bottom. We'll grab some more. Keeping that primary idea that there are little mounds of all of these fallen leaves. However, there is a larger movement within the actual ground. Remember to put them in between the steps. And we move upwards as we run out of paint. Okay. Now as we get towards the bottom, we can press slightly harder with our brush, but not much, to create these larger markings. We still want lots of openings though. If you find that your brush is starting to condense and your bristles are getting closer together, you're getting less markings, do just clean your brush and then dry it fully and then come back to the paint. I'm not there yet, but I can tell that it could happen soonish. And there's a larger mound, as we talked about here, so I'm just going to note the top of it, essentially. And then work this underneath, and that'll be a harder shadow because of the fact that light can't get to it. And then we'll be a bit more deliberate, a bit more open with our applications as we get up here. Again, I should be holding my brush back a little bit farther. Just letting it dissipate. Rotate my brush just so I can use the paint on the other side too. Now I like this, but we do need more color, so now we'll interject a bit more of our red and our yellow into the mix. You can see that it's still not bright or all that saturated. but it will create a good variance. And I'm going to try to adhere to the motions and movements that we've already instigated. I'm also going to try to keep this more into the center opening area where that light is coming through. Because these are areas that are just a little bit brighter, that have that opening. There we go. It's all about layering, right? And we can't forget the in-between, or this area of the foreground. The goal is to still keep a lot of the darker openings though, as that will create a lot of the contrast and depth. Now, yet again, we head back to our palette. This time we'll make sure there's a bit more yellow, and we'll brighten it, not to a great deal, but enough to create a bit more contrast. I'm going to be very careful with this. Keep it predominantly in this middle area, and then have it work out here. Now at this point, my brush is starting to condense the pigment a little bit. So I'm actually just going to make a lot of markings closer to the foreground, because you can tell that they're larger now and it actually looks like larger leaves. That's just because the brush, these bristles are getting closer and closer together, or clumping a little bit, and it's a great look. So we'll take advantage of this, rather than cleaning it and drying it to get the smaller markings again. And then again, we'll work up towards the top, staying closer to the stairs. Letting that light work its way in without overdoing it. Now that I have almost no paint, I can work towards the right-hand side and just make it a cohesive palette and texture without bringing too much attention to that area. Now, one more time, we'll make it slightly more orange and slightly brighter. There we go. We're going to be very selective with this. Doesn't go everywhere. It's not used in abundance. It's closest to the steps. You can see you get so much quick, easy texture. Now we're going to take a step back. We're going to grab our flat-headed brush, take the majority of the paint off of it, and we're going to create a green that's fairly desaturated with some burnt sienna. So we need titanium white and Mars black to desaturate it. We don't want it to be really bright, we don't want it to be really dark. We want it to be dark-ish. Something akin to this should work quite well. I'm going to take the fan brush, and I'm not actually going to clean it. You could, but I don't mind if I get a little bit of that orange still on there. And I'm just going to work a little bit of this color into the ground as well, for bushes and other low-sitting foliage. Let's make it a little bit brighter. We're doing this from a distance, that way we can just ensure that we're not overdoing anything or ruining the balance within the piece. There we go. That's nice. Being very deliberate with these markings. Really don't want to overdo it. Make it too prominent. There we go. Looks nice. We can add just little hints of it into the foreground. Just splash it about. Now, while we're diversifying our color, I'm just going to clean this quickly so that the pigment doesn't dry on it. Doesn't have to be a great clean, we can do that a little bit later. But we're also going to do that with our 1-inch. And typically I do this off camera, but I figured I would just take some time here to note that I'm doing it so that you remember to do so with yours as well. Now, heading back to the liner, we're going to create a more orange, brighter variant of what we were using for our orange foliage. Like that. And using this brush, we will very intentionally create additional little fallen leaves, which will sit close to the steps. Typically I like to lead them off of the step itself just to show that there's an extra height to it, and then there's a dip. And your platform where you'd step is going to be brighter because the light can come down on it. But then when there's this dip here, that's land that goes like this, so it's opposite to the light, so it'll be darker. And it might be rounded, so you might have that slowly dissipate down. You don't want to overdo it, which is again why the camera is so far away, just so you can look at it from a distance rather than get caught up in the details. And you can vary this color as you go. I'll do so myself, just to make it a bit more unique, as the leaves would be. I don't want to do too much of it. I think I'm going to take a 5-minute break, just see how I feel about it as I come back, and see if I need to add more. But so far, I am quite happy with it. Now we can definitely and will definitely add additional leaves to this, build it up, maybe add some fallen branches. However, before we do, I want to reintegrate the larger portions of the trees. So I'm going to start with a mid-ish value, incorporating our green, titanium white, and Mars black. Remember, we don't make it as dark as it can be because we want to add in the darker shadows afterwards. You can tell that's a bit too saturated. So we'll work in more of our Mars black and titanium white. Still not too dark. I think this will be great. Using the 1-inch flat because it has a nice sharp edge for rendering trees, but it can also pick up a lot of paint. So we're just moving that down. And I know it doesn't look like it matches currently. That's okay. Remember that this does take a couple of layers. And it's a friendly reminder, if you haven't started yet, and you're watching until the end, that we do have to go through these awkward stages to get to the stages that look quite nice. You can also incorporate burnt sienna into this mixture. You can see that I have lots of little drawings on here as well to remind myself where everything is going to go. And of course, if you'd like help with the drawing process, the traceable is up over on Patreon. With that, of course, you can use the gridded version to sketch it out, or you can use tracing paper, or you can use a miniature projector. A lot of different ways of working with that, depending upon your preference. And up there, of course, you can also get access to all of my ebooks, including Acrylics for Beginners, which is essentially the essentials, everything you need to know about acrylic painting before you jump into your first acrylic painting. There are also a bunch of ebooks full of other traceables, and you can get access to our exclusive Facebook group where everybody shares their artwork, their renditions, and it's a community I'm very proud of. A lot of wonderful people helping each other out. Kind of amazing. But with that, I just made a darker mixture, switching over to the dry fan brush as we did the first time. We'll tap in lots of texture, working predominantly vertically with our taps. This is the same practice that we instigated when we rendered this initially, and I am bringing it up slightly into the pre-existing bark moss just because it will just create a nice added detail and texture. Then we reincorporate it over here. This one is already quite dark, and I think I need a little bit more paint. The beauty of jumping from tree to tree here is that we essentially let them dry as we work on the other ones, and then we can just jump into the next step, as we are right here. So lots of texture. Work that up the tree a little bit. Put that back down. Switch back to the 1-inch flat, where we can now mix up more of a mid-green, similar to what we have here. You can see we're getting to these colors quite quickly because we've been doing a lot of mixing and we are in the habit. But now we'll switch to the liner brush. And remember, with these applications, we look for the light, where it's coming from. So on the left-hand side trees, we're painting it on the right-hand side for the most part. And it's a bit of a tap and drag effect. Starting on the edge, because that's where it's most important. We leave little openings, we let it dissipate as we move towards the left-hand side. This also isn't as bright as our previously applied mix, so it doesn't look cohesive yet, but we want to build it up. Rather than going in with a singular highlighted pigment. On the right-hand side of the canvas, remember we paint the left-hand side of the tree with highlights, so it's the opposite. And we're just letting it dissipate. Great. Now this should have dried. It has. So I start on the edge, and you can see I'm not making a singular long stroke. I'm making a plethora of smaller strokes. That's very intentional, because I want it to feel a little bit rugged, like we're working with mossy bark. And then we just start working our way in. Grabbing from the top, leaving lots of openings. We can start to close gaps here and there to make more dense areas that protrude, larger ones. And as you run out of paint, we just work towards that left-hand side. Now we need to brighten up some of the highlights in there. So we'll just remix a bit more of that pigment, but this time work in slightly more titanium white. You can see I'm mixing right beside the previous mix. That way I can use that as an example. Make sure I'm not straying too far, because we do want it to be brighter, but we don't want it to be that much brighter. And I think this should be great. So, larger brush down, essentially mixing brush down. Make it a little bit brighter. And you can see that this is much more cohesive with our previous mix. If you're worried that it's not perfect, just tap it slightly throughout the rest of the tree. That way it at least has perfect matches throughout. And there we go. You can also see that it's getting a lot quicker as we progress. We get comfortable, we learn the techniques. And even if you know the techniques, even if you've done this before, sometimes it does just take a little bit of time at the easel to get warmed up, get those Fine motor skill is firing. That's okay. So yet again, we start on our edge. We'll work our way in, here and there. Define some routes for the bark. Don't want to do too much though. This is on the edge. Would like it if the tree could act as a bit of a vignette, so I don't want to incorporate too much color. Though if we do too much, we can always work it back with a darker mix. That's the beauty of acrylics, they're very forgiving. You don't like something, you just let it dry for 5-10 minutes, you go back and you paint over it. It's like nothing ever went wrong. And likely you learned a lesson in it. So it's actually a good thing. There we go. Now I've gone ahead and redrawn my tree here, which we're going to mix the colors for using our Mars Black, half green, half burnt sienna, and titanium white. We'll go for quite a dark mix here. Realistically, we're not going to have room to do the 3 layers where we tap on the extra texture. So I want to start with the darker layer, and then we can add on highlights where it makes sense in relation to the light. So, before we add any foliage, we're just going to paint in our branches. And it's worth noting, I'm not trying to softly create a singular elongated line. This is something where I want a lot of markings to slowly build into the subject. And we want it to be a lot of markings so that it gets a bit more of a jagged look, a bit more natural. Where it could be very soft and feel a little cartoony. So here we go. We want the ends of our branches to be the smallest, so less pressure there. Using quite a bit of water in our mix so we can get those really small markings. That does mean we'll have to go over quite a few portions multiple times, but it's worth it to get that really clean line work. And I'm just playing with it a little bit too. So, once we have that, we can start incorporating some highlight to it. So let's add some extra green, extra titanium white. Make it nice and watery. Light's coming in this way, so the top of it will get the highlight. Trying to still be mindful of where the light is. I'm not just outlining it. There we go. Subtle, which is nice. I'm also going to take this opportunity to use some of the darker mixture that we have and just create some little branches that have fallen, that are working in and around our leaves. There are lots of breaks in them. I'm very intentionally going between brighter ones because that's where they'll stand out better. And a lot of them kind of intertwine, so it looks like they're partially underneath and they're above. I'm just scattering these throughout. There we go. Trying to make sure I get both sides. As we get into the distance, they should get smaller. And we don't want to overdo it initially. We can always go back and add more. I think that's good for now. Okay, so that is dry. We are going to mix up a relatively bright orange. So we'll start with a lot of our cadmium yellow, half of that in our cadmium red. We'll make it earthy with half of that burnt sienna. And then we need to desaturate it. So a little bit of Mars black. You can see I'm continuously taking it off the brush. And we do need it to be a much more red heavy mix for this to not be a green. We'll grab some titanium white, not to brighten it, but to desaturate it. Just like that. Now, we'll head over to our newly painted tree and start working on some leaves and clusters of them. A lot of this area should be relatively dark because we're towards the base of the tree line. And that's great because it means this will actually stand out. Now we are using a lot of the cadmiums, which are innately fairly thin. So our first layer will look quite unfinished. We will need to add extra paint once it dries. I think I'm going to make my tree and its foliage a bit more sparse than what's in the reference photo, at least initially, and we can build on it should we want to. But I do really like this more dominant orange over the darker backdrop that we currently have. That said, we don't want to cover too much of it because then it won't stand out in the way that it does. Also, down towards the bottom, trying to be quite mindful of where the other fallen orange foliage is. Oh, that was hard to say. And create clusters, that way it stands out. Because individual pieces like that won't to a great degree in a lot of places. So now we're heading back up to the top. And I think to proceed, I should probably get you a little bit closer. There we go. Another little tip. Typically we grab water to really thin it out. If you feel very confident in your stroke, you can avoid that here and you won't have to do as much layering. But you do need a clean amount of paint on your brush. You do need good control, because if you're not using water, you're likely working with a larger application. That said, I'm now going to make this mix a bit brighter extra yellow and titanium white, a little bit of extra red, not much. And I'll apply this towards the tops. You can see it's similar to what we have through there. Not going over all of the previous applications at all. And I might want to make it a little bit darker as we move down, so mix it more with the previous mixture. Yet again, find at the tops of each cluster. And I like the progress a lot now. They're getting slightly darker as you move down, especially over towards the right-hand side. And slowly building it out. Might have a couple down here. Okay, now we started to incorporate that nice brighter pigment into the tree. It's important that it's cohesive with the rest of the piece. So I'll take that. I'll just make sure that we have it splashed into the areas that will be a bit higher. Predominantly closer to the path. There we go. Nice and easy. Let's go a little bit brighter yet again. Really don't want to overdo this color. Just because it's so strong. You can see I'm holding my brush farther back, so I have a bit more of a loose stroke. Trying to randomize it along the edges. And we'll add some extra light back here. Okay, now we're going to take a couple steps back. We'll grab our filbert brush, some Mars Black, Cad Red, Burnt Sienna, a little bit of our yellow, but we definitely need more red and burnt sienna than that, and we'll grab a hint of titanium white, not to brighten it, but to desaturate it. Darken it yet again with Mars Black, and we're essentially looking for a nice color for our foliage. The filbert brush, as you can see, when you make a tap, you can make it look like a leaf. And it's a great way of building out this vignette we already started establishing. If you make it slightly darker than what you previously had, it'll also layer on nicely and give it some extra depth. I will be doing this to both sides, and I'll probably bounce back and forth between the two. You can see how we can build it out in a couple of different areas. Try to keep my hand out of the way. Covering a lot of the trees through here. It's going to separate this tree from the rest, which is nice. Make it look a little less monotonous. see they were painting foliage and leaves in so many different ways, depending upon where it is perspective-wise in the painting. We do need more pigment. So same colors as last time. A lot of red, a lot of burnt sienna, a lot of Mars black, a little bit of titanium white and cadmium yellow. There we go. I like that a lot, actually. As noted, we are going to do the other side. So really bring the attention towards the center of the piece, where we want it. And this is a bit of an artistic liberty, not presented in the reference photo, but I do think it will really aid what we're trying to do here. Don't want to overdo it. There we go. Starting to get there. We can work it either in front of or behind the tree that we've just rendered, the smaller one. If you have areas that you don't like of that tree, you can cover them up now. Or if you love the tree, you can work around it. I'm doing a little bit of both, so it looks like they intertwine with each other, giving us the most amount of depth. Now we'll head down in the painting with the flat-headed brush. We're going to mix up a very dark brown using the burnt sienna, Mars black, a little bit of titanium white. Make it just slightly more saturated. And using this pigment right here, we are going to start working on the boards that create the steps. Now this could be darker, but we want to leave room to make details darker. And we want to work on our edges first before we work on the middle section. So see me kind of carve out the space initially and then start to work in. Now this is a very thin pigment because burnt sienna is a very thin color. Means we will need multiple layers. That's okay. Essentially, by the time we work from the bottom to the top, the bottom should be dry, so we'll be able to work our way back there without having to take a break. I'm being fairly loose with the bottom, so that we essentially have the implication of leaves finding their way on top of the board, where the top, or rather in front of the board, where the top of the board is much sharper. And intentionally so that it looks like it's in front of all of the backing leaves. There we go. Not sure if you can hear the train in behind, but I always love that sound. Just find it really calming. feel like this is definitely a path you end up finding a railway track on. Slowly working our way up. Filling in what little canvas space we see left. You can see I can do multiple applications now without having to refill my brush because they're just getting so small. And that concludes all of the white space on the canvas. However, we are going to continue these up here and just have them get lost behind a lot of this foliage. Now, we'll see if this is dry, and we are in luck. So I'll mix up a good amount of additional paint. Remember, we don't want it to be too dark because you want room to darken it. And every layer we add, it'll look a little bit more professional. That said, it will also look quite flat because we are yet to add any depth or detail. We also need to have the top of all of these boards, which will have a rather large impact. There we go. And from there, we are going to want to let this dry. So we'll take a 5, maybe 6 minute break, and then we'll get right back to it. So now what we can do is take essentially that burnt sienna, mix it with titanium white, a little bit of Mars black, not much, but enough to darken it, desaturate it. We're going to head to the top of our board, which is standing up vertically, and we're just going to paint the top of it. Go all the way across. We're not working in a lot of our other oranges because we don't want it to blend too much with the leaves. Here we have a bit of a brighter pigment. You can see we're just cutting across, doing it through taps, maybe a little bit of a drag, but I'm really not trying to create elongated strokes. Same ruling applies here as it did when we were working on the tree branches. And I'm trying to make it look a little bit rough. We'll get smaller with them as we move farther and farther into the back. Here, where it's a bit more condensed, we can start showing that the steps are getting smaller and smaller. And we're not doing as much texture, so now I am starting to drag a little bit more. There we go. Need to go over a couple areas numerous times. Then we'll make something that's a little bit darker than what we previously had for the bottom portion. Switch over to the fan brush. And I'm actually going to make some elongated strokes and turn my brush while on the canvas, just to give it some little creases in the wood, little inset portions. Now we'll mix up a slightly lighter version than what we have on the canvas for the initial layer. Needs to be quite dark still. You can see that it's also not a perfect mix, and that's intentional. I want to pick up multiple colors here. And they're all very similar, but they will make this more interesting. Sometimes the markings will be bigger, sometimes they'll be smaller. Likely be a little difficult to see from where you are, but the point is it's that subtle. Let's get you a little bit closer. So you can see it a little bit better from here, but let's make it slightly brighter. A little bit more titanium white. Bump up that saturation with the burnt sienna. Back to the fan brush. There we go, a bit more noticeable. And you can see that I'm trying to get a bit of a swirl to it here and there. Trying to make all of them look nice and unique. Just give us some depth and texture. Okay. Yet again, we brighten, we saturate, we make it slightly inconsistent. Going to be careful with this just because it is getting to be a little bit bright. Don't want too much of it, but just enough so that it looks cohesive with the top of the steps. There we go. Still dark, but it's character. Now, something else I want to do with this pigment is work a little bit of it into our tree. Get that nice mix of green and brown here in the foreground. Trying to work predominantly where there are already markings. Just build on those. Trying to dodge a lot of the foliage, but that's okay. We can always go back in and repaint that foliage. And I'll also do it on the trees that are fairly close, but not to the same degree. And then as I run out of paint, I can just make this nice little tapped scratch look towards the back. There we go. Like that. Have a little bit of extra titanium white, brighten it. And just build that up a little bit more along the edge that's going to be receiving the light. There we go. Nice and textured. Maybe we can just tap on a couple little spots here too. Now, something else I really want to do as we step back is create smaller tree branches to work our way through a lot of the silhouetted foliage that we have. So I'm back to the 1-inch flathead. I know it's a really large brush, but it does have that nice sharp edge to it. I'm just going to grab a little bit of our green, a little bit of our burnt sienna, Mars black, hint of titanium white, and we're going to make sure our brush is nice and damp so we can get a very sharp marking. I'm going to cut on top a lot of this foliage, make it larger as we get towards the bottom, have little individual branches that break out. The amount and the way in which they move is very much up to you, but I do try to make sure that they're always evolving. We're still not making larger elongated markings. We're connecting taps and such. These will stand out best when they're layered on top of highlight. So where we have a lot of this orange is great. This is one of those subjects where it's difficult to overdo it. You can also work highlights onto the edges where there would be light. I just picked up some accidentally, and now we're just interjecting this lighter brown along the edges of some portions that will receive more light. Here we can grab a bit of it intentionally from the palette. You should be able to see that quite well. It's fairly stark. Recognize that a lot of it will be blocked by shadows though, so we do need to be mindful. There we go. Like that a lot. Go back to the darker mixture. Work that through portions of this side. Lots of little areas to connect. There we go. Might interject a little bit of this darker mixture down into the bottom steps. Just get an extra value and texture in there. Use this to separate portions of our tree as well. Tap in additional texture. One of those things where we can go back and alter so many little pieces now because we have the bones implemented in the way that we need them. That said, I'm going to switch to my flat-headed brush, my smaller one, grab some titanium white, a little bit of our yellow, a little bit of our red, very small amounts of each. And I'll just open up some of these spots. And this isn't necessarily the color of the sky because the sky did have a hint of blue, but this is essentially very thin foliage where light is leaking through. One of those things I just felt we could have more of as the painting progressed. Love that. Love, love, love that. With that said, we are nearing the end. I always like to give you a little keyword that you can use in the comment section to note subtly that you are one of the often 13% who make it to the very end. One of the dedicated few. And today, I think we'll just go with the term autumn. So you can just leave that as a comment itself or integrate it into a sentence, but if you do so, I and everybody else who got this far will know that you were, again, part of that great community that made it to the end. I'd also like to say, as per usual, a massive, massive thank you to everybody up over on Patreon for directly supporting the channel, making this happen. This channel is predominantly community funded up there, and it is because of you that I'm able to make these much longer instructional lessons. So big thank you to all of you for directly making this happen. There we go. And of course, if you are new here, and this is one of your first lessons on the channel, you too can sign up to Patreon by just following the link in the video description. Up there you can find, again, all of my ebooks, our exclusive Facebook group, The Traceable, to help you with the drawing process, a bunch of bonus lessons, some of which on canvases this size, others on 24 by 36 inches. So much larger, much bigger projects if you're interested in that sort of thing. Also, thank you for putting up with me today as I attempt to relearn how to talk with Invisalign in my mouth. I know that my speech is far from perfect, and if you made it this far, I genuinely appreciate you. So, thank you. That said, at this point, I really am just doing little touch-ups, finding areas that I want to be a little bit brighter, interjecting that light, and I think this is about where we call it. So, thank you for being here. Thank you for being a part of the community. I hope you had a nice, relaxed stay. I hope you feel inspired to go out and create your own piece. And I wish you a great deal of success with that. You have a lovely weekend. And above all, as always, stay creative.